Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, this debate takes place against a background where this country this year it will be in deficit of $16.8 billion. $16.8 billion, Mr. Speaker. This country has been spending at the rate of $300 a week, $300 million a week, Mr. Speaker, more than what it's been taking in. And for a family of four, Mr. Speaker, that's $300 a week. The average New Zealand family, Mr. Speaker, a father, a mother and two children, this country, this government has been borrowing $300 a week per family, more than what it takes in, sir. And so the irony for the Minister of the Climate Change to stand up and say more debt is the last thing this country needs right now, what an incredible irony. He's suggesting that this government, this National Party, is concerned about debt, yet it's his party, Mr. Speaker, who has presented a budget to this Parliament that in the last year we spent $16.8 billion more, sir, than what we took in, and in the current financial year, Mr. Speaker, looking at a deficit of just under $10 billion. Mr. Speaker, this debate takes place and against a background where we've seen a debt crisis in the United States. The United States came on the brink of defaulting on its debt, Mr. Speaker, on the brink of defaulting. And we see in Europe, Mr. Speaker, an unfolding debt crisis, not just in Greece and Ireland and Portugal, but in countries we once knew to be stable and strong, countries like Spain and Italy, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, the ACT Party just recently sent out over 100,000 letters all around New Zealanders, asking New Zealanders whether we should be following a policy of borrow and hope, or whether this government should be living within its means. And we got an overwhelming response. Thousands of New Zealanders returned the survey form, sir, to Parliament, saying they totally rejected a policy of borrow and hope, and they supported a policy of getting the country back within, sir, its means. Sir, the Minister talked about competent and consistent financial management. He talked about reducing debt. He talked about getting the country back into surplus. Well, I would say to that Minister, Mr. Speaker, if he was really concerned about reducing debt, if he was really concerned about getting this country back into surplus, this National Party, the National Party, sir, that leads the government, would have taken a much closer look at its expenses. He referred to the emissions trading scheme. Few New Zealanders understand, Mr. Speaker, that Vote Climate Change has allocated some $2 billion of credits to foresters. $2 billion of credits to foresters. Now, sir, some of those credits have been allocated to people who have pre-1990 forests and are denied the chance to convert that to a more productive use. And, sir, those people are suffering a real loss. Equally, Mr. Speaker, there are people who have pre-1990 forests who can only use that land for forestry, who have suffered no loss and will be getting a windfall gain under his emissions trading scheme. Worse still, Mr. Speaker, the emissions trading scheme provides an incentive to go out and plant trees. It provides a one-off incentive of about 200 tonnes of carbon per hectare, or a subsidy of about $4,000 a hectare. Mr. Speaker, that is sufficient. That is sufficient for a forester to go out and buy high country land and plant trees, and this government is giving away essentially free forests, and the Minister knows about it. And so for ministers of the National Party to stand up and pretend that they are concerned about the cost of living, concerned about the cost of debt and concerned about exports, sir, is a joke, because there are many ways in which this government could have reduced its expenditure, reduced its expenditure to bring it within budget, just like New Zealand families have to do, Mr. Speaker. But this government has pursued a policy of borrow and hope, and, sir, it may well come back to rue that day, particularly when we see the unfolding situation in both Europe and the United States. Mr. Smith said our package was about changing incentives. Well, yes, it was important to change incentives, but it would have been better still if the tax package had been about reducing taxes. It wasn't about reducing taxes. It was about, sir, improving incentives. And yes, improving incentives are important. It is important to reduce the marginal rate of tax, Mr. Speaker. It is important to send that incentive. And in that regard, we congratulate the National Party. The real issue, Mr. Speaker, is to have far greater controls on government expenditure, reduce expenditure, get the debt under control, sir, and the ACT Party is committed, sir, to promoting policies that will do just that. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable David Cunliffe.
Mr Speaker, it's not often that I have the opportunity to agree with the Honourable Member who's just resumed his seat, but I do on this point.